My name is Evelyn Hayes, and I am 38 years old. For most of my life, the story other people told about me was a simple one. Quiet, eccentric Evelyn, who lived alone on the property her grandmother left her, always pottering about in that ramshackle garden shed. They said it was a shame. A woman of my age, with no husband, no children, just her strange hobbies and the odd smells that would sometimes drift over the hedgerows. And for a long time, I think I believed their story. I believed that the bubbling beakers and meticulously labeled soil samples in my shed were a mark of my failure to live a normal life. I never imagined that those foul-smelling concoctions, the very source of my family's constant worry and quiet shame, would one day become the last hope for our entire county. I never dreamed that the survival of the very people who scorn me would come down to the one thing my own father begged me to abandon. Before I dive into the story of how a catastrophic blight, a father's bitter disappointment, and a single jar of dark, earthy liquid led me to the halls of the Royal Society, I want to connect with all of you listening right now. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever had a passion that no one else understood, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And for anyone new here, if you believe in the power of quiet determination, consider subscribing to join a community of people who understand that sometimes the most important work is done far from the spotlight. My world, for the first 3.5 decades of my life, was circumscribed by the expectations of others. It was a world shaped by the rich, dark soil of Somerset County and the even darker soil of familial disappointment. I grew up on the Hayes family farm, a sprawling tract of land that had been in our family for 5 generations. It was my father's kingdom, and my brother, William, was his heir apparent. From the moment William could walk, he was perched on my father's lap on the tractor, his small hands on the giant steering wheel. He was taught the rhythms of the seasons, the heft of a healthy potato, the golden promise of a field of wheat. He was strong, practical, and utterly uninterested in anything that couldn't be plowed, planted, or harvested. He was, in my father's eyes, perfect. I, on the other hand, was a puzzle my father, Thomas Hayes, never cared to solve. Where William saw fields to be conquered, I saw a complex ecosystem teeming with life I yearned to understand. My treasures weren't bushels of corn but the iridescent shell of a beetle, the intricate network of mycelium on a decaying log, the way a certain clover seemed to thrive in the porous soil. My earliest memory is not of the farmhouse, but of the small, weathered shed at the far end of my grandmother's garden. She was my father's mother, a woman with dirt permanently etched into the lines of her hands and a quiet wisdom that my father had inherited as stubbornness. While he was teaching William about crop rotation, my grandmother was giving me my first magnifying glass. "Look closer, Evie," she'd whisper, her voice raspy like dry leaves. The biggest stories are told in the smallest spaces. That shed became my sanctuary, my university, my cathedral. After she passed, the property was left to me, a small cottage and an acre of land that was considered too rocky and small for proper farming. It was seen as a paltry inheritance compared to the main farm that would one day be William's, but to me, it was the entire world. The shed was my laboratory. I saved for years from my part-time job at the village library to buy a second-hand microscope, glass beakers, and Bunsen burners. I spent my evenings reading dense textbooks on soil chemistry and botany, my weekends conducting experiments that usually ended in failure, filling the air with the scent of algae, compost, and strange minerals. This pursuit was a source of constant, grating friction with my family. To them, my passion wasn't a science. It was a bizarre and unseemly obsession. Sunday dinners were a weekly tribunal where my life choices were cross-examined. I remember one evening in late spring, the air thick with the scent of lilac and roast chicken. William was boasting about his new cultivator, a monstrous machine that could till 20 acres before lunch. My father was beaming, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's my boy," Thomas said, his voice rumbling with pride. "Working the land, making something of himself." His eyes then shifted to me, the smile tightening into a familiar line of disapproval. "And what have you been up to, Evelyn? Still making your potions in that shed?" Martha from next door said she saw smoke coming from your chimney at midnight. "For goodness sake, you'll burn the place down." I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks. "I was sterilizing petri dishes, Father. I'm trying to isolate a specific strain of nitrogen-fixing bacteria." He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Bacteria, potions. What's the difference?" "It's nonsense. A woman your age, you should be thinking about settling down. William and his wife are giving me grandchildren. You're giving me a headache with all this talk of microbes." William chuckled, a soft, patronizing sound. "Leave her be, Dad. She's our resident mad scientist. As long as she doesn't blow herself up, what's the harm?" The harm was in the slow, steady erosion of my confidence. The harm was in the deep, lonely ache of knowing that the people who should have been my biggest champions saw me as a fool. Their words were like a persistent, low-grade poison. I would return to my little cottage, the scent of their disapproval clinging to me, and stand in the doorway of my shed. For a moment, I would see it through their eyes, a cluttered, chaotic mess of strange equipment and dirt-filled jars. A monument to my own strangeness. Was I wasting my life? The thought was a constant, unwelcome guest. But then my eyes would land on the chart I was mapping of nutrient absorption in brassicas, or the delicate, fern-like crystals I had precipitated from a solution, and the passion would flare up again, a stubborn pilot light refusing to be extinguished. This was not a hobby. It was a vocation. It was the language my soul spoke, even if no one else could understand it. My only real ally was Martha, my elderly neighbor. She had known my grandmother well and saw the same spark in me. She never pretended to understand the chemistry, but she understood the curiosity. She'd bring me cups of tea and old seed catalogs, her eyes twinkling as I tried to explain the process of creating a chelated iron supplement for her anemic-looking roses. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she'd say, patting my hand with her own gnarled one. "She always said the land has a voice if you're quiet enough to listen." Their desperation made them volatile. The tension between them finally snapped during what would be our last Sunday dinner for a long time. The roast sat untouched on the table. "We should have modernized years ago," William said, his voice raw. "Listen to the advisors. Better irrigation, different fertilizers." "Don't you dare blame this on me," my father shot back, his fist hitting the table, making the glasses jump. "This is an act of God. It's not about fertilizers. Your grandfather farmed this land with his bare hands and never saw anything like this." Grandfather wasn't dealing with a super blight, William yelled. He wasn't competing with imports from the continent. "You're stuck in the past, and it's ruined us." Watching them tear each other apart was agonizing. This was my moment, I thought. This was my chance to help them, to make them see. I had been working nonstop, refining my formula, convinced I was on the right track. With my heart pounding, I retrieved my notebook and a small, corked bottle of my latest batch of fertilizer from my satchel. The liquid inside was dark and thick, smelling of the deep forest floor and the sea. I placed the bottle on the table between them. "Father, William, please listen to me." They both stopped, turning to look at me as if they'd forgotten I was there. "I think I can help," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I opened my notebook. "This isn't just a disease. It's a symptom of a larger problem. Our soil it's exhausted. It's lost its natural resilience. I've been developing a fertilizer, a tonic. It's not just nitrogen and potassium. It's a complex solution with chelated micronutrients, copper and boron, mainly, and I've managed to culture several strains of phosphate-solubilizing bacteria and beneficial fungi. The idea is to not just feed the plant, but to rebuild the soil's microbiome, to help the plants fight back on their own." I looked from my father's face to my brother's, praying for a flicker of understanding, of consideration. I saw nothing. William just stared at the bottle, with a look of exhausted disbelief. My father's face, however, was slowly contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "You dare," he hissed, his voice trembling. "You dare to come in here, while we are facing utter ruin, the loss of everything our family has ever worked for, and you bring us this witchcraft? This bottle of filth from your stinking shed." He picked up the bottle, his knuckles white. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to throw it at the wall. "We don't have time for your games, Evelyn," he roared, his voice cracking with anguish and fury. "My life's work is rotting in the ground, and you bring me mud in a jar? Get out. Get out of my sight, and take your pathetic hobbies with you." The words struck me with a physical force. It wasn't just dismissal anymore. It was a violent, total rejection of me and the one thing I had to offer. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sharp. I looked at William, a silent plea for him to intervene, to say something. He just looked away, his jaw tight, offering me nothing. He was a coward, complicit in his silence. I snatched my notebook from the table, turned, and fled. I ran from the house, the sound of my father's fury echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the sanctuary of my shed, where I collapsed onto a stool, the sobs I had been holding back finally breaking free. It was the lowest point of my life. The shame and hurt were so profound, I felt like they were dissolving me from the inside out. All my work, all my hope, it was just a joke to them. Mud in a jar. I cried until I had no tears left, leaving me empty and strangely calm. I sat there in the quiet of my shed, surrounded by the evidence of my pathetic hobbies. The bubbling cultures, the meticulously labeled jars, the charts on the wall. And as the sun went down, casting long shadows across my workbench, something inside me shifted. A cold, hard resolve began to form in the hollow space the hurt had created. Fine. If they wouldn't listen, if they saw me as a fool, then I would be a fool on my own terms. I would prove myself right, not for them, but for me, for the land itself. My plan was simple and, to anyone else, would have looked like an act of madness. I had a small, 10 by 10 foot patch of garden behind the shed that I had always used for experimental planting. The next morning, with a grim determination, I took a spade and walked to the edge of my family's blighted potato field. I dug up a clod of the diseased, stinking earth, carried it back as if it were a sacred relic, and worked it into the soil of my test patch. I was deliberately infecting my own land, creating a tiny, controlled pocket of the plague. Martha watched me from her garden, her face etched with worry. "What are you doing, dear?" she called out. "An experiment, Martha," I replied, my voice hoarse. "I have to know if it works." Then I took my fertilizer, my mud in a jar, and diluted it in a watering can. I carefully and methodically drenched the soil of the infected patch. I treated every square inch, the dark liquid soaking into the contaminated earth. When I was done, I drove stakes into the ground around the plot and tied string between them, quarantining it like a plague pit. There was nothing more to do but wait. The next few days were an agony of suspense. Every morning, I would wake up and my first act would be to rush to the window that overlooked the patch. For 3 days, nothing changed. The few tomato plants and runner beans I had in that patch began to show the telltale signs of blight. Dark spots on the leaves, a slight wilting. My heart sank with each new spot. I felt the weight of my father's words, the echo of William's laughter. Asterisk, mad scientist. Witchcraft. A fool. Asterisk, maybe they were right. On the 4th morning, I almost didn't look. The disappointment was too keen. But I forced myself to go to the window, bracing for the sight of black, collapsed plants. I stared, and then I stared harder, blinking, convinced my eyes were deceiving me. The black spots on the leaves hadn't spread. In fact, they seemed smaller. The wilting was gone, and near the base of one of the tomato plants, a tiny, vibrant green shoot was pushing its way through the treated soil. It couldn't be. It had to be a trick of the light. I ran outside, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knelt by the string fence, my eyes scanning every inch of the plot. It was real. The plants were not dying. They were fighting back. The blight had been halted in its tracks. A week later, The difference was undeniable. The test patch was an island of defiant life in a sea of decay. New growth was lush and vigorous. The soil itself seemed darker, richer, more alive. I took samples and looked at them under the microscope. The aggressive, thread-like hyphae of the Phytophthora were sparse, seemingly outcompete by a flourishing population of the beneficial bacteria and fungi I had cultured. It worked. My God, it actually worked. A wave of elation, so pure and powerful it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. It was a feeling more potent than any praise, more resonant than any validation I had ever sought for my family. It was the clean, clear chime of truth. I hadn't been wasting my life. I wasn't a fool. I was a scientist. And I had found an answer. But an answer that stays in a 10 by 10 foot patch of garden is no answer at all. My family's farm was still dying. The whole county was still dying. My father's words had made it clear that he would never accept help from me. Going to him again would be pointless. Another exercise in humiliation. I needed a different path. I needed an authority they couldn't dismiss, an ally they couldn't ridicule. That evening, as I was washing my beakers, I heard the town crier in the village square, his voice carrying on the still evening air. He was announcing a special emergency council meeting to be held at the town hall in 2 days' time. Agricultural ministry officials would be there, along with county leadership, to discuss the crisis and potential relief measures. Then he announced something that made me freeze, a beaker slipping from my soapy hands and shattering in the sink. Dr. Alastair Finch, a renowned botanist and a fellow of the Royal Society, would also be in attendance. He had been in a neighboring county studying heritage apple varieties when the blight struck and had agreed to offer his expertise. The Royal Society. The name itself was like an incantation, evoking images of Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, the greatest scientific minds in history. It was a world so far removed from my cluttered shed that it might as well have been on another planet. A terrifying, audacious idea began to form in my mind. It was a long shot, a gamble of such epic proportions that it made my hands tremble. But what other choice did I have? I couldn't let my discovery die in my garden, because my father's pride was too big and his mind was too small. For the next 2 days, I worked with a feverish intensity. I didn't just prepare my fertilizer. I prepared my case. I gathered my notebooks, selecting the pages that showed my methodical progression of formulas and results. I took photographs of the test patch with my old box camera, capturing the stark contrast between the healthy, thriving plants and the blighted wilderness beyond the string fence. I carefully printed them in my makeshift darkroom, the images appearing like ghosts in the chemical bath, tangible proof of my success. I wrote out my hypothesis on clean sheets of paper, my handwriting neat and precise. I rehearsed my explanation over and over, trying to distill years of complex research into a few clear, concise minutes. With every word I wrote, with every photo I developed, I felt a layer of my old, timid self sloughing away. I was no longer just Evelyn, the strange daughter. I was E. Hayes, researcher. The night of the meeting, I dressed carefully, not in my usual dirt-stained work clothes, but in a simple, dark dress my grandmother had left me. I bottled a fresh sample of my fertilizer, the dark liquid seeming to pulse with potential. As I walked the mile to the village, my satchel containing my life's work heavy on my shoulder, every step was a battle against the screaming voice of doubt in my head. Asterisk, they will laugh at you. You're a librarian, not a scientist. Your own father called you a fool. Who do you think you are? Asterisk, but another voice, quieter yet more persistent, pushed back. Asterisk, you know the truth. You have the proof. You are doing this for them, even if they don't deserve it. Asterisk. The town hall was packed, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, fear, and desperation. The faces in the crowd were gaunt, etched with worry. I saw farmers I'd known my whole life, their shoulders slumped in defeat. And then I saw them, my father and William, sitting near the front, their expressions grim and stony. My heart gave a painful lurch. For a moment, I considered turning back, fleeing into the anonymity of the night. But then I saw Dr. Finch sitting at the front table with the council members. He was a man in his late 50s, with kind eyes, a tweed jacket, and an air of quiet intelligence. He looked out of place, and yet he was my only hope. I slipped into a seat at the very back, my hands clammy, my stomach a knot of terror and resolve. The meeting was as bleak as I had expected. The man from the Agricultural Ministry, a paunchy official with a condescending tone, offered little more than bureaucratic platitudes and forms to fill out for disaster relief that would amount to pennies on the pound. The farmers grew restless, their murmurs of discontent rising to angry shouts. "Forms won't save our harvest," one man yelled. "We need answers, not paperwork," cried another. The council chairman, a flustered man named Peterson, banged his gavel for order. "We will now open the floor to suggestions from the community. Please keep your comments brief." Several farmers stood up, their voices cracking with emotion as they described their ruin. They offered desperate, hopeless ideas, prayers, mass plow-unders, even outlandish folk remedies. With each speaker, the cloud of despair in the room grew thicker. My moment was coming. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to jump. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. "It's now or never, Evelyn." Taking a breath that felt far too shallow, I stood up. The scraping of my chair legs sounded impossibly loud in the tense silence that followed the last speaker. Every head in the room turned towards me. "My name is Evelyn Hayes," I said, my voice trembling over the first few words before finding a fragile purchase. I saw my father's head snap around. His eyes widened in horrified disbelief, his face flushing a dark, angry red. William looked down at his hands, his entire body radiating embarrassment. I ignored them. I kept my eyes fixed on the front table, on Dr. Finch, and began to walk down the central aisle. The crowd parted for me, a sea of bewildered and skeptical faces. I reached the podium and gently placed my corked bottle and my folder of notes on the wooden surface. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, feel their judgment, their pity, their scorn. I took another deep breath, picturing my little test patch, green and defiant. "Like all of you, my family is facing ruin," I began, my voice growing stronger. "I have watched this blight lay waste to land that has been farmed for generations. The government's solutions have failed. Their fungicides have failed. And I believe I know why. We have been fighting the wrong battle." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "We've been treating this as a simple infection," I continued, opening my notebook. "But this pathogen, Phytophthora agricola, is an opportunist. It preys on weakness. And our soil, for all its apparent richness, has become weak. Decades of monoculture farming and a reliance on simple NPK fertilizers have stripped it of essential micronutrients and decimated its natural microbial life. We've created plants that are big, but fragile." I held up the bottle. "This isn't a poison to kill the blight. This is a tonic to strengthen the soil. It's a complex formula containing chelated copper and other trace minerals that are vital for a plant's own immune response. More importantly, it reintroduces beneficial bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi that unlock nutrients and actively compete with the pathogen. It doesn't just fight the disease, it restores the land's own ability to defend itself." I laid my photographs out on the podium. "This is a test plot for my own garden. I intentionally infected it with blighted soil a little over 2 weeks ago. This first photograph is from day 3. I held it up. The image was clear, showing the wilting plants, the dark spots spreading on the leaves. "And this," I said, holding up the second photograph, "is from this morning." The image showed the same plot, but now it was a patch of vigorous, healthy green. The contrast was stunning. A gasp went through the room. But before the crowd could process it, a large, bull-necked farmer named Jedediah stood up, his face red with derision. "What is this nonsense?" he boomed. "A magic potion brewed up by Thomas Hayes's odd daughter? We're serious farmers here, not children listening to fairy tales." Laughter, harsh and mocking, erupted from a few corners of the room. And then, the ultimate humiliation. My own father stood up, his face a thundercloud of shame. "Evelyn, sit down," he commanded, his voice shaking with fury. "You are making a fool of yourself. Of our family. This is no place for your hobbies." The words were a physical blow. The room began to swim. The doubt I had fought so hard to suppress came rushing back, a suffocating tide. I was a fool. This was a mistake. I opened my mouth to apologize, to retreat, but before I could speak, another voice cut through the noise, calm and authoritative. "I would like to ask Miss Hayes a few questions, if I may." All eyes turned to Dr. Alistair Finch. He had risen from his seat and was walking towards the podium, his expression one of intense, scholarly curiosity. He picked up my notebook, his eyes scanning the pages with practiced speed. The room fell silent. "Miss Hayes," he said, looking at me over the top of his spectacles. "You mentioned chelated copper. What chelating agent did you find most effective, and how did you buffer the solution to prevent phytotoxicity at a foliar level?" The technical jargon was a lifeline. He was speaking my language. The fog of shame in my mind cleared instantly. "I used a citric acid agent derived from fermented citrus peels," I answered, my voice clear and steady now. "It proved highly stable. As for the buffering, a potassium phosphate buffer maintained the pH at a steady 6.8, which allowed for maximum nutrient uptake without causing leaf scorch." He nodded slowly, a small smile touching his lips. He fired another question, this one about the specific strains of bacteria I had cultured, and another about the synergistic relationship between the seaweed extract base and the mineral salts. With each question, I felt my confidence swell. This was my work. I knew it inside and out. I was no longer a frightened daughter seeking approval. I was an expert defending her research. The crowd listened, their initial mockery replaced by a stunned, confused silence. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the dynamic that was unfolding before them. Finally, Dr. Finch closed my notebook and gently placed it back on the podium. He turned to face the assembled farmers, his gaze sweeping over their bewildered faces before landing on my father. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice resonating through the hall. "For weeks, my colleagues and I have been approaching this crisis as a simple pathogen problem. And for weeks, we have failed. We have been trying to kill the predator while ignoring the fact that its prey is weak and defenseless." He gestured towards me. What Miss Hayes is proposing is not witchcraft. It is a brilliant and elegant piece of ecological science. She is suggesting that we stop fighting the disease and start healing the patient, the soil itself." He tapped my photos. "Her methodology is sound, her documentation is meticulous, and her results speak for themselves. This is the most promising lead I have seen since this crisis began." He looked directly at the council chairman. "I propose we suspend all other efforts and immediately organize a full-scale field trial of this formula. I will supervise it personally." A profound, absolute silence descended upon the town hall. No one moved. No one spoke. I looked at my father. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, his face a pale mask of shock. The fury was gone, replaced by an expression I had never seen on him before. Utter, stupefying confusion. It was as if the world he had known his entire life, a world with clear hierarchies and simple truths, had just tilted on its axis. And in that moment I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the town hall meeting were surreal. Dr. Finch, true to his word, moved with astonishing speed. He commandeered a 5-acre plot of my family's most severely blighted land, right alongside the main road, ensuring the trial would be visible to everyone. The irony was not lost on me. The stage for my potential vindication was the very ground my father believed I had shamed myself upon. A strange assortment of volunteers appeared, a few younger farmers intrigued by Dr. Finch's endorsement, some curious townspeople, and Martha, of course, who organized a rota to bring us all tea and sandwiches. Brewing my fertilizer on such a large scale was a monumental task. We used old, sterilized dairy tanks donated by a neighboring farm that had already lost its entire herd. The process filled the air for half a mile around with the rich, pungent aroma of my formula. It was the smell of hope, a stark contrast to the cloying stench of decay that had permeated everything for weeks. The most surreal part was William. He showed up on the first morning, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. He didn't look at me. He just walked up to Dr. Finch and said, "What do you need me to do?" He worked tirelessly, hauling sacks of minerals, monitoring temperatures, cleaning tanks. He followed my instructions to the letter, his usual easy confidence replaced by a quiet, humbled diligence. He never spoke of the dinner, never apologized, but his presence was its own form of penance. His sweat was his apology. My father, however, was conspicuously absent. I would catch glimpses of him watching from the distant farmhouse window, a silhouette behind the glass. He couldn't bring himself to come closer, trapped between a lifetime of dismissive pride and the undeniable evidence of my work unfolding on his own land. His absence was a gaping hole, a silence that spoke volumes. Dr. Finch was a constant, reassuring presence. He treated me not as an amateur, but as a colleague. We would spend hours discussing soil chemistry, debating the optimal application rates, and poring over the data from his field microscope. He saw the scientist in me that my own family had refused to acknowledge, and under his mentorship, I felt myself unfurl, my confidence taking root and growing stronger with each passing day. The results of the trial were breathtaking. Within a week, a faint but discernible fuzz of green appeared on the treated soil. Within 2 weeks, the line between the trial plot and the surrounding wasteland was as sharp and clear as if drawn with a ruler. On one side, the gray, skeletal remains of the blighted wheat. On our side, a carpet of vibrant, emerald green shoots, pushing defiantly toward the sun. The blight had been stopped, and life was returning. The news ripped through the county. A constant stream of cars and carts began to line the road beside the field, farmers and townspeople coming to stare in silent awe at the miracle unfolding on the Hayes farm. They no longer saw me as odd Evelyn. They looked at me with a mixture of wonder and reverence. They called it Hayes's formula, and they clamored for it, desperate to save what little they had left. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over our impossible green field, I was cleaning equipment in the shed. I was bone-tired, but filled with a deep, quiet satisfaction that was entirely new to me. I looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the twilight. It was my father. He stood there for a long time, just watching me. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his usual commanding posture gone, replaced by an uncertain fragility. He cleared his throat. "The field," he said, his voice rough. It's green." I simply nodded, continuing to wipe down a glass beaker. I didn't know what to say. There were too many years of hurt, too many dismissive words hanging in the air between us. He took a hesitant step into the shed, my sanctuary he had so often mocked. He looked around at the charts, the equipment, the bubbling jars, his eyes filled with a new, dawning comprehension. I don't understand any of this, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. He ran a hand over his face. Your grandmother, she was like you, always looking at the small things, the things everyone else overlooked. She always saw things differently, too. It wasn't the apology I had craved for years. It wasn't an admission that he had been wrong, that he had been cruel. But it was something. It was a crack in the fortress of his pride, a fumbling attempt to bridge the chasm he had created between us. And I realized in that moment, with a startling clarity, that I didn't need his apology anymore. His validation, which I had spent my entire life desperately seeking, no longer held any power over me. My work had validated itself. I had validated myself. Yes, I said, my voice even. She did. He nodded, seemed to want to say more, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there for another moment, then turned and walked away into the gathering dusk. A few days later, Dr. Finch approached me, his face glowing with excitement. He was holding a sheaf of papers. Evelyn, I've drafted a preliminary report on our findings for the Royal Society's journal. Your discovery has implications that go far, far beyond this county. This could change how we approach agriculture in the face of new, aggressive pathogens." He paused, his eyes bright. "I've listed you as the primary author, of course. We need to get this published. And then I believe we should go to London. You should be the one to present this to the Society." London. The Royal Society. The word sounded foreign, impossible. Me, Evelyn Hayes, from my little shed, addressing the most prestigious scientific body in the world. The idea was so vast, so overwhelming, that I couldn't fully grasp it. I looked from Dr. Finch's excited face to the vibrant green field outside, a testament to what had once been just an idea in my head. A year ago, I would have laughed at the suggestion, convinced it was a cruel joke. Now, I simply nodded. 1 year later, the scars on the landscape were beginning to heal. The county had survived. Hayes's formula, as everyone now called it, was being produced by a new farmers' cooperative. I had insisted on the structure, ensuring the formula remained affordable and accessible to the community that had nearly been destroyed. I served as the head of research and development, working out of a new, properly equipped laboratory built for me on the grounds of the co-op. The old shed in my garden remained my private sanctuary, a place for my own, more esoteric experiments. The Hayes family farm was saved. My relationship with William had been slowly, cautiously rebuilt. The shared trauma and the grueling work of the trial had forged a new respect between us. He now sought my advice on soil management and crop health, treating me not as his strange little sister, but as a valued and brilliant colleague. We found a new, easier way of being with each other, the old tensions replaced by a quiet, mutual appreciation. My father was changing, too. The process was slow and painful for him, like a great, ancient tree being forced to grow in a new direction. He would visit me at the new lab, watching me work with a quiet, lingering awe. The pride he now felt was so immense it was almost comical, but it was tinged with a deep, unspoken regret for all the years he had wasted not seeing me. The pinnacle of this new reality came in the autumn, when Dr. Finch and I traveled to London. I stood at a podium in a grand, wood-paneled room, its walls lined with the portraits of scientific giants. The room was filled with the keenest minds in the nation. I was terrified, but as I began to speak, to share my research, my data, my story, the fear melted away. I spoke of the soil as a living entity, of the delicate balance of its microbiome, of the holistic approach needed to maintain its health. I spoke with the passion and authority I had earned through years of lonely, dedicated work. When I finished, there was a moment of profound silence, and then the room erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. It was a sound of acceptance, of recognition, of profound respect. And as I looked out at the sea of faces, I saw two in the front row that mattered more than all the others. William and my father were standing, their faces streaked with tears, clapping harder than anyone. In my father's eyes, I finally saw it, not just pride, but a deep, aching understanding of who I truly was. Today, I am back in my garden. The late afternoon sun warms my face as I crumble a handful of rich, dark earth between my fingers. It's teeming with life, fragrant and healthy. My shed, my real shed, is still here, a monument to my beginnings. Life is different now, filled with correspondence from scientists around the world, requests for speaking engagements, the responsibilities of the cooperative. But this, right here, is where I am most myself. The journey was never about seeking fame or proving my family wrong. It was never about revenge. It was about a deep, abiding love for the land and an insatiable curiosity about its secrets. I learned that my father's approval, the thing I thought I needed like air, was a cage I had helped build for myself. My real strength wasn't in winning his acceptance, but in realizing I didn't need it to be whole. I had my own work, my own truth, and that was more than enough. I had to save his world to be allowed into my own, but in the end, I found my place not by conforming to their expectations, but by finally, fully, and unapologetically embracing the woman who had been there all along, tinkering away in her garden shed. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey and for listening to my story. The most important lesson I took away from all of this is that your value is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. It exists independently, a quiet and persistent truth. I'd love to hear from you now. Have you ever pursued a passion that others dismissed? Share your story in the comments below. This is a safe space to celebrate those quiet victories. And of course, if my story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Your support makes this community possible. Remember, sometimes the world will tell you that you are strange or that your passions are foolish. Let them. Being underestimated can be the greatest advantage you will ever have. Thank you for listening.